Since 2003, MCJ has worked to create a more equitable and just Mississippi, a better Mississippi, through our dedicated legal campaigns that are centered around health and public benefits, fair housing, consumer protection, immigration, disaster recovery, and impact litigation. You know, we work across a broad array of issues because addressing the root causes of poverty, especially in a state such as Mississippi, requires intersection of efforts. We confront a wide range of challenges facing racially and economically marginalized Mississippians head on. And we have an exceptional track record of making real, positive, sustainable change. Unfortunately, we all know that the systemic assault against the rights of the oppressed, disenfranchised, and poor won't end anytime soon. There is always, always more work to do. Before we get started this evening, I'd like to introduce our host. I know you've heard of the 6 degrees of separation. Well, in Mississippi, as in many areas of the South, but we've found, particularly in Mississippi, we can probably whittle that 6 degrees down to about 3 degrees in a general conversation over a glass of sweet tea, a glass of Chardonnay, or maybe even an old fashioned, to realize that we are so connected. Sometimes we find out that we're related or related to somebody that we know or that we've gone to school with over the years. Our 3 hosts present that type of example here tonight of that Mississippi connection. I will introduce them to you at this point and then invite them back later on to have a few words regarding their connections to Mississippi and their support of our work at the Mississippi Center for Justice. Our first host, of course, is Olger C. Twyner III, who has been a supporter of MCJ since its inception through his connection with MCJ's founder, Martha Bergmark. Martha was executive director of the Southeast Mississippi Legal Services during Olger's time there. Olger later served as MCJ's development director. He is now executive director at Community Impact at Columbia University. Thank you so much, Olger, for hosting this event. And of course, we have our next host is Mary Miller, who grew up in Jackson before moving away for college. She was introduced to MCJ by our other co-host, Joanne Edgar, who invited her to a gathering in New York hosted by our former MCJ president and CEO, Riley Morse, several years ago. Mary was so impressed by MCJ that she became an enthusiastic supporter of the work MCJ is doing to make Mississippi a better place. Mary was senior vice president and general auditor for American Express, but is now enjoying retirement. Thank you and welcome, Mary. Our next host is Joanne Edgar, who hails from Baton Rouge, Louisiana, but her roots through many generations on her mother's side are purely Mississippi. She grew up in the 1960s in Jackson. She enrolled in as a student at Millsaps College, and again, a connection to MCJ's founder, Martha Bergmark. Martha's dad was Mary's college professor at Millsaps. And of course, Martha and Joanne have known each other since they were teenagers at this point. Hence, she's been connected with MCJ from the very beginning. She's a very big fan of MCJ's Great Mississippi Road Trip that she's going to tell you all about. And certainly once we're able to get back on the road beyond this pandemic, we invite you all to join us on one of the most wonderful experience through the history of Mississippi, particularly the Mississippi Delta. So Joanne is a communications consultant and a writer. Thank you and welcome, Joanne. Thank you so much for hosting this event. Now, I look forward to hearing from each of our hosts later in our program. So I'll see you all later. As I mentioned earlier, our work, our work at MCJ crosses many areas of law and advocacy. One of our most prominent areas is that of the George Riley Impact Litigation. The director of George Riley Impact Litigation campaign at MCJ is Mr. Rob Medgar. Rob, welcome to the program.
Hi, Evangeline, and hello, everybody.
Rob, how important, I want to get right to it because we've got a lot to cover this evening. So how important is MCJ to equity in Mississippi? Let me, I guess, a better Mississippi. I want to hear particularly about the impact litigation, and I want to hear about one of our most recent accomplishments and victories. Of course, that is the Curtis Flowers story.
Sure. And Curtis Flowers case is important on many levels, and it is a case out of the small town of Winona, Mississippi, unprecedented in the history of the American legal system, because Curtis Flowers endured 6 trials for capital murder, spent 23 years in prison for a crime he did not commit. The 2 of the trials resulted in hung juries and therefore mistrials. The other 4 were reversed on appeal because he was convicted and given a death sentence, and all 4 were reversed on appeal because he did not receive a fair trial in any of them due to the misconduct of the prosecutor, a district attorney named Doug Evans. I was asked to join the case and lead the defense for Curtis after it was sent back to the Mississippi trial court by the United States Supreme Court, which reversed the 6th conviction, the conviction in the 6th trial, due to what it called the relentless, determined effort by the prosecutor to rid the jury of Black individuals in all of the 6 trials. So at that point, I came into the case. When it arrived back for a potential 7th trial, we filed a motion for bail and a motion to recuse the prosecutor from further participation in the case due to his prior misconduct. Now, I had met Curtis Flowers about 3 months earlier at Parchment, and I came away from that meeting thinking, there is no way this man could have committed those murders. He's one of the nicest people you will ever meet. And he had a spotless prison record after 23 years, which is almost impossible. No fights, no altercations, no acting out. The people who served time with him, the guards were around him, all attested to his peaceful disposition and his positive spirit. And when the case came on for a bail hearing on December 16, 2019, as we awaited a potential 7th trial, we presented evidence that had been collected by his lawyers since the 6th trial, and evidence collected by the intrepid investigative reporters from the podcast In the Dark, which featured Curtis's case in season 2, all of which undermined the prosecution's case. And we also pointed to his prison record and to the statements we had from several prison guards of his peaceful disposition, which demonstrated he would not be a danger to the public if released on bail. And this peaceful disposition also illustrated how the case against him never made sense in the first place. 4 people were killed in a downtown furniture store on a weekday morning in Winona, Mississippi, with precision shooting, and the store was robbed. 8 days earlier, someone had broken through the roof at night and had unsuccessfully tried to crack the safe and left through a side door with a key. And whether or not those two events were connected, we think they were, but even if they weren't, this was clearly the work of professional criminals on the day of the murders. Yet they arrested a 23-year-old gospel singer with no prison record and no criminal record and nothing in his history to demonstrate an inclination or an ability to commit a crime like this. And so at the conclusion of the bail hearing, the judge granted bail to Curtis Flowers. He was released that afternoon and was free for the first time in 23 years. 3 weeks later, the district attorney voluntarily dropped out of the case in the face of our motion to recuse him. Mississippi's new attorney general was appointed to take over the case. We immediately embarked on a campaign to persuade her to dismiss the charges. We put together a 40-page memo. We had a Zoom presentation with her staff, and in September of 2020, the charges were dismissed. And what you see now is a picture of Curtis on the Zoom call he had with his lawyers when it was announced that the charges were dismissed and he was allowed to take off the ankle monitor that he had to wear since he had been released on bail. And so he was finally free. The charges were lifted. The cloud was lifted from over him. He was exonerated. And since that time, we have obtained for him the maximum financial compensation allowed under Mississippi law for innocent people who are wrongly convicted. We are considering looking at a separate lawsuit to try to recover additional compensation from the people who wrongfully caused his conviction, although the prosecutors unfortunately have immunity from suits in that case. So it's going to be a difficult battle, but we're going to do what we can. And we will be filing a bar complaint in the very near future against Doug Evans, not only for his misconduct in the case, but for the lies he told on camera to 60 Minutes about Curtis and the episode they did about Curtis's case. But he is doing very well. He is a remarkably well-balanced person, and fortunately, 23 years in prison did not take that away from him.
Wonderful. The Curtis Flowers story is an extraordinary story, and I think it also highlights a number of issues that unfortunately Mississippi and some other states, but in particular Mississippi, has been plagued with for years as it relates to discriminatory or legal processes. So can you just tell us briefly what were some of the critical issues that led to MCJ's involvement in the Flowers case? Because we don't normally jump into criminal cases unless there are overarching issues that impact that have the potential to impact the greater body of citizens.
Can you hear me all right, Angela?
Yes.
There's a lawnmower going on in the building next to my office, and it just all of a sudden got really loud. So I apologize if you can't hear me. The systemic issues that were really present in Curtis Flowers' case were prosecutorial misconduct and racial discrimination in jury selection. And so we took the case not only to help exonerate him, but because to raise the profile on those particular issues. And this fits in with some of the other work that MCJ is doing in the area of the criminal legal system, including prison conditions work that you'll be hearing about a little bit more about in a minute.
Okay, great. And also, of course, our impact litigation, George Riley impact litigation campaign is the area that area that we focus on overarching systemic issues. Sometimes those issues may arise through working across campaigns from some of the direct services, but often it can be related to voting rights redistricting, which we know that we are, recently coming off the heels of an election where we did have some voting rights issues, early voting issues that MCJ was involved in litigation regarding that, as well as what we have on the horizon related to what's going to happen as a result of the census data. Can you talk to us a little bit about the voting rights, our involvement in voting rights?
Yeah, we are in the middle of a challenge to Mississippi's felon disfranchisement provision, which is part of the racist 1890 Constitution that's still one of the provisions that's still in place in Mississippi that targets certain particular crimes that were perceived to be Black crimes as in 1890 as those for which people should be permanently banned from voting if they're convicted. We filed a motion to expand, a lawsuit to expand absentee voting for the 2020 election in light of the pandemic. And we are going to be very involved in the redrawing of district lines as a result of the post-census redistricting that will occur for state legislature, county governing boards around the state, and city councils to make sure that Black voters are fairly represented in the new lines that are drawn around the state.
And before we move to Paloma Wu, your Deputy Director of George Wiley Impact Litigation, I want to ask you about some recent litigation that you and MCJ have become a part of. Can you tell us about that? I think people are going to find it really interesting that we are connected way down there in Mississippi, way down here in Mississippi.
Yeah, we are joining as co-counsel in a case in Washington, D.C. against the Proud Boys, the Oath Keepers, Rudy Giuliani, and Donald Trump over the January 6th invasion of the Capitol. The lawsuit was originally brought by Congressman Benny Thompson from Mississippi, who's the chair of the House Homeland Security Committee. It has since been joined by 10 other members of the House Representatives, including Karen Bass and Barbara Lee from California, Gerald Nadler from New York, and several others. And the suit is brought under the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871, a provision of which prohibits conspiracies to interfere with federal officials carrying out their official duties, which is what the members of Congress were trying to do on January 6th in certifying the electoral vote when the mob sparked by Trump and Giuliani, including the Proud Boys and those Oath Keepers, invaded the Capitol. So it's going to be a very, very interesting case that, of course, is in many ways intertwined with our work on protecting the right to vote.
Okay. Wow, man, you look around and MCJ is involved and in some extraordinary work. Thank you, Rob. And we should invite the person doing the lawn work on in to join us this evening. I want to hear now from our Deputy Director of George Wiley Impact Litigation, Ms. Paloma Wu, who's going to talk to us about MCJ's recent involvement with prisoner rights, prison conditions. Paloma?
Thanks, Angela. I think it's helpful talking about our prison work to just step back a second to talk about where Mississippi fits into the world. The United States is the highest incarcerator in the world as a country, and then Mississippi is the second highest incarceration rate in the United States. Louisiana has the first, and between them, Mississippi has the highest proportion of its residents who are African American, and Louisiana has the second. Incarceration is lockstep with white supremacy. So we attack issues involving incarceration along with attacking the white supremacy that it seeks to perpetuate. We do it on two fronts. The first is trying to alleviate the torturous conditions that people are subjected to when they're incarcerated. And the second is trying to stand with communities and people inside to help facilitate and support acts of self-determination and practices of self-actualization right now. Separation, family separation, community separation is the most violent aspect of incarceration. taking people from their chairs at the dinner table, taking people out of the parent-teacher conferences, making it so that people can't go to work every day and save for the next generation like you know that they want to. All of these things that we do and that we prevent people in prison from doing. And then as salt in the wound, when they go back into the community, they are hit with collateral consequence after, I hate that word, collateral, it needs another word that's worse. You know, can't find work, can't get a job, can't get housing, can't get loans for education. So we can't just attack the conditions, we have to stand with the communities and be clear that we're talking about white supremacy. So in Mississippi specifically, incarceration was absolutely necessary to perpetuate the slavery economy that persisted for 100 years and more after the Civil War. Convict leasing system was a system in which they rounded up African-American men for things like vagrancy, crimes that were just targeting African-American men so that they could chain them together and lease them for profit to the very landholders who were using African-American slaves before the Civil War. So we in Mississippi have a huge problem with incarceration because we have a huge problem with racism, and we had a huge problem with the economy of slavery being the heart and soul of Mississippi's economy for a long time. So in trying to go against incarceration, one of the first chinks in the armor, we are honored at MCJ to have David Littman, MCJ board member, be on the forefront of this. Parchman Prison, the notorious convict leasing prison up in the Mississippi Delta in the 1970s, he was one of the people on the legal team that brought a landmark case, Gates v. Collier, that gave constitutional minimums really for the first time for things like medical care and for these sort of torturous conditions of confinement and these practices of arming white prisoners to shoot Black prisoners on site who were for no reason while they were working, denying handcuffing people to fences and other forms of torture. Fast forward, decades later in the early 2000s, they are in Mississippi, we are doing this to Black children. So overwhelmingly Black children who are being held in these notorious training schools. So you become a ward of the state when you're quote unquote adjudicated delinquent, and they were put into these training schools where hundreds of children, the majority of whom had diagnosed mental illness health issues, were also many for status offenses like runaway or what have you. They were being put in these forced paramilitary programs where it was found that girls with mental illness were being shackled for 12 hours a day, weeks at a time, to poles without mental health care or education. Rob and MCJ was part of the initial litigation against some of these schools that led to Columbia Training School being closed. Fast forward another decade, Rob's part of the litigation team that goes up against Walnut Grove, one of the most dangerous prisons in Mississippi, in America at the time. People were being killed and maimed through uprising. Children tried as adults, meaning 13 and above in Mississippi, were being held with adults and they were being sexually assaulted in that prison. That litigation, then subsequent to that litigation, Walnut Grove is closed. Fast forward that right now, we are honored to be part of a litigation team that is representing a class of thousands of mentally ill inmates at one of the third largest prison in Mississippi on a case that is brought constitutional claims because they're not being kept in a safe way. They're being held in barbaric forms of solitary confinement lasting years and years in the dark. So we're working with other people on as part of that appellate team that's in the Fifth Circuit right now. Fast forward to last year, we filed a case on behalf of people who are in the first and second largest prisons in Mississippi, CMCF and SMCI. We're representing people on a constitutional claims because they are not being given what they need to protect themselves against coronavirus. We were able to get an agreement in that case in place to get some of the CDC recommended practices implemented in those two prisons. So those are some of the conditions of confinement issues that we've been looking at. But the self-actualization to determine, self-determination issues that we look at, I'll just give you, just as an example, voting in prison. Thousands of people in prison are eligible to vote because they have not been convicted of any of the crimes that take your right to vote away, but nobody knows that they can vote, how they can vote, They don't have the materials to vote. So we, along with our partners like Black Lives Matter, worked very, very hard to put together voting guides for people in prison so that they could figure out if they can vote, how then they can register, and that they can vote absentee. So that's a project we're really, really proud of. Also, when the CARES Act stimulus checks became available, many people in prison qualified. We and our partners were very lucky to be able to send out over 17,000 packets with directions, 1040 forms, posted envelopes to people who would not otherwise have been able to try to pull that money down. We received some really amazing stories about how people were able to push that money, for example, to their children, saying it was the only time they really felt like they were able to give and support, you know, their children who they can't be with, and like what that does for them. And what it does for them to be able to buy some basic hygiene supplies that are very difficult to come by in prison if you're indigent. And, you know, about issues of self-actualization right now, reading the books you want to read is really important. And, you know, Rob was involved in litigation that made sure that when MDOC wanted to cut off all books other than religious ones to people in prison, that there was a First Amendment challenge followed very quickly by an agreement to let books back in. And then, you know, part of self-actualization and standing with communities is truth. And as part of that practice, you know, we represent right now the Marshall Project, which is one of the preeminent journalism organizations that focuses on criminal justice issues. We represent them in getting records that they're entitled to under law to investigate rank corruption in the Mississippi Department of Corrections. So MCJ we're lucky to come from a line of people and, you know, projects where we've been able to try to fight issues of conditions. And then we're also very, you know, we're very lucky to stand with communities and community organizations and our friends inside to try to help them, support them to fight white supremacy, which is what incarceration is.
Thank you, Paloma. You know, but all of that, people don't recognize the day-to-day work, or may not understand or realize the day-to-day work that's what I call boots on the ground, 365. You know, I know that the last year, toward the end of last year, the year before, there was a lot of attention given to a lot of the riots and brutality that was occurring in the Mississippi prisons, particularly Parchman Prison. And, you know, people would come to us at MCJ and say, you know, are you all involved in this? And what they did not realize is that we've been involved a long time. We've been boots on the ground. We're not newcomers. We are a small, homegrown public interest law firm that, you know, we make a lot, we do a lot with a little,
Sure
but we're there when change is needed. We've been there. And so I appreciate you giving us that full picture of exactly the impact of MCJ's work, not just now, but how we've been in the trenches for a number of years. So, you know, one thing that we do know is that we're not, you know, in 2019, there was another incident of government overreaction with regard to the ICE raids that connects the prison system with detention. And I'm going to ask our director of our immigration campaign to tell us about our amazing work in immigration and how that also connects with Mississippi's prison issue or incarceration issue. Amelia McGowan.
Thank you, Vangela, and hello, everybody. So I just want to give an update after the ICE raids. I know many of you probably remember the horrific 2019 ICE raids. Following those raids, the U.S. government thrust most of the 680 Mississippians it arrested into removal, or what we used to call deportation proceedings. Nearly 2 years after the raids, we estimate that over 200 workers have now been deported. The rest continue to remain in legal limbo, and likely will for years as they face the possibility of permanent removal from their homes, their families, their communities, and even exposure to more danger and death. So I want to show you just a glimpse of what these proceedings are like.
little nervous this morning? See? Do you understand what these proceedings here in court are all about? You know what a lawyer is? No? Do you have a lawyer? No?
So that just gives you a glimpse of what the immigration court system looks like and feels like. People facing deportation, children and adults alike, fight within a system that is totally designed for them to fail. They're thrown in an adversarial process to face an ICE prosecutor, like you saw in the video, and an often hostile judge. And if they can't afford a private attorney or can't find pro bono counsel, they have to navigate these proceedings alone and in English, and sometimes from detention. In addition, these immigration courts and immigration policy are heavily politicized and subject to the whims of the president, as we saw in recent years. People seeking protection from persecution and torture, like asylum seekers, often suffer the most. So under the Trump administration, just to give you an example, asylum seekers and refugees suffered over 90 separate policies eroding procedural and substantive due process protections, more than any other group of non-citizens. And while Biden has reversed some of these policies, he's failed to take an action on many others, and that perhaps in an effort to look tough on immigration. But despite this tough landscape, MCJ is actively fighting back, thanks in large part to your support. Through our partnerships with pro bono attorneys and firms, our team has coordinated free merits and appellate representation for 118 raids impacted Mississippians. That's everybody from the raids who requested a free attorney and signed up for our waiting list. And that ensures that they don't have to face this daunting process alone. And also in partnership with Aiken Gump, our virtual DACA clinic has also provided free legal representation to Mississippi Dreamers. And that removes this threat of deportation for them and provides them with legal protection to work and study and thrive in our state. And finally, we're fighting for stronger safeguards for Mississippians fleeing persecution and torture, and that applies to many people arrested in the ICE raids. We're the only nonprofit in Mississippi focusing on representation and advocacy for asylum seekers, and we're only one of a few in the region. But in addition to our individual representation, we've also taken our asylum advocacy to a regional and even nationwide scale. Our unique focus on appellate representation of asylum seekers has secured Board of Immigration Appeals and federal circuit court victories that fortify protection for asylum seekers that go far beyond our individual clients. And in addition, our asylum work has earned us an active role in a nationwide asylum working group. And that's given us a place to work alongside organizations like the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees and the American Immigration Council to advocate for policies that restore and expand our national commitment to protecting people seeking safety from persecution and torture. So even though the landscape is really difficult for immigration, we are definitely not one to shy away from tough battles. So despite the challenges, we remain committed to continuing this fight for policies that welcome and respect the rights of immigrant Mississippians. And we really want to thank you for your continued support in making our work possible. So while this is just a general overview of our work, I invite any questions in the Q&A about our specific work following the session. Thank you.
Before you leave for a minute there, Amelia, I want to hear about some recent work that we have that it's one of the areas that I am just very, one, I can say I'm dismayed by the reason for us having to get into this fight, but I'm excited for what lies ahead for us and for the residents of the Mississippi Delta as a result of us being able to get into this fight. I want to hear about what the case that I call the H2a Visa case.
Absolutely. So there's a particular case that has been a great opportunity for our impact, our immigration, our consumer protection teams to work together. We've collaborated and joined with Southern Migrant Legal Services to file a suit on behalf of 2 South African migrant workers who suffered labor exploitation in North Mississippi. In this particular case, a Winona farmer hired our clients as farm workers under what's called the H2a Temporary Agricultural Visa Program. and offered them what's called the prevailing wage that's required by the government for agricultural work specifically. And in doing so, the farmer also certified to the US government that he could find no US workers able or willing to take these particular jobs. But when our clients got to the United States to work, they found a much different story. Instead of getting a farm work as they had been promised, the farmer made our clients drive trucks to farms across the Southeast at a staggering average of 95 hours a week. But he still paid them the wages of farm workers and denied them the 40% higher prevailing wage that was owed to truck drivers. So our suit exposes and challenges these practices and sends a clear message to employers that all Mississippians, regardless of immigration status, have a right to a fair wage. And there's another component of this work. So this obviously talks about the harms to immigrant workers. I want to pass the mic to Ty, my colleague from the Consumer Protection Team, to talk about how this abuse of the H2A program also hurts US workers.
Thank you, Amelia. As you know, farming is a significant part of life in the Mississippi Delta. Over 100 farm owners in the Delta are taking advantage of the H2A temporary agricultural visa program, which is okay. The program exists to help farmers. Unfortunately, many of them are abusing the program and exploiting not only H2A workers, but also US citizens in the Delta who are usually Black and poor. Under the H2A visa program, when a farm owner hires an H2A worker, he has to also hold that job open to a US citizen worker. And if the US citizen worker applies and is qualified, he must hire him or her first. Additionally, if the farm owner employs both an H2A worker and a US citizen worker, he has to pay them both the prevailing wage. Just over the past 2 months, in 3 counties in the Delta, encompassing 7 farms, we have identified nearly 20 US citizen farm workers, local farm workers here in the Delta, who have come forward about potential violations regarding wage rates and equal treatment. And earlier, Amelia mentioned that the minimum hourly wage set by federal government for agricultural work is actually around $11.33 an hour. Over the past several months, I have met and interviewed local US citizen farm workers who are being paid as little as $7.25 an hour. Now, here's where it gets even messier. When we think of the H2A worker, we usually imagine workers who from places like South America, for example, Mexico. Well, in this instance, in the Delta, the H2A workers are not from South America. Some of them aren't. I've driven up and down Highway 61 and Highway 49 here in the Delta, and I see white workers driving farm equipment out in the fields. Many assume these are family members of farm owners, but in actuality, many of them are white South Africans who have been brought to the Delta under the H2A visa program, which is legal. However, I mentioned earlier that they are being taken advantage of the same way that local American farm workers are being taken advantage of. Also, although the Mississippi Delta has one of the highest unemployment rates in the country and one of the highest poverty rates in the country, some of the farm owners in the Delta claim that they can't find people to work on their farms. Well, this is just not true. Local community members, especially Black people in the Delta, have been doing farm work for generations. What's really happening can be shown in a situation I encountered a few weeks ago when I interviewed a local Black farm worker in Sunflower County. And let's call him Greg. And Greg informed me that he has been working on a particular farm for the past 24 years. And over recent years, he'd been instructed by the farm owner to train one of the white South African workers to operate farm equipment, tractors, cotton pickers, combines, and fertilizers. Well, Greg said that he knows that there are other family members and local community members who already know how to operate the equipment and were searching for work, but were being denied in favor of the H2A visa workers, in this instance, workers from South African, white farm workers from South Africa. And what adds insult to injury and what really hits at home is that after Greg trains the white South African H2A visa workers to operate the agricultural equipment, the white South African is then paid more than Greg, even though they are both doing the same job. Today, Greg makes $7.25 an hour.
Wow. And the stories continue. We know, Ty, and I know as a son of the Mississippi Delta yourself, hailing from Rolling Fork, Mississippi, that the Delta of Mississippi is one of the most impoverished areas in the United States. It's almost, in some areas, some people would think they're in a third world country. So for jobs and financial resources to leave or not be paid to, made available to the residents of this area is just mind-boggling. I know that on a daily basis, as part of your work in the Justice Court Navigator program, you encounter many instances of people who are barely making enough to cover their, whether it's their rent or to pay for the rent to own furnishings, or to repay some of the predatory lenders that they have to subscribe to in order to get money to cover necessities. So I'd like to hear about your work under the Justice Court Navigator program, and I think it ties definitely with wages that are not a living wage in Mississippi. The $7.25 an hour. And just imagine Greg and many other Gregs and Deborahs and Marys that are making, working 24 years and still making $7.25 an hour. And I would also probably guess that they probably don't have insurance. And of course, Mississippi's governor and leaders have refused to extend or expand Medicaid coverage to allow for poor people to have adequate health care. So talk to us about what you see on a daily basis in justice court.
Yeah, and thank you, Angela. Well, we all know that one of the poorest regions in the United States is the Mississippi Delta. I know this to be true because even though I have visited more than 23 countries in nearly every state, I was born and raised in poverty right here in the Delta. And this is specifically why, after I retired from the military, I, one, attended law school, and two, applied for a fellowship to work at the Mississippi Center for Justice after graduation. And my fellowship is called the Delta Justice Court Navigator Program. The program is particularly focused on ensuring people in low-income communities have equal access to the justice system. For the past 8 months, I have driven over 16,000 miles up and down highways and back roads throughout the Delta, where I have sat in on cases in justice court in some of the poorest communities in the country. And here are a few statistics I gathered over the past several months visiting these communities. I've attended over 300 civil cases in justice courts. Nearly 80% of the defendants being hauled into justice court in these communities are Black women, and many of them single mothers. A staggering 99% of defendants I've seen in these low-income communities appear for their justice court hearings with no legal representation. 99% in civil cases in justice court. Conversely, over 70% of the companies, such as payday loan businesses, credit card companies, and medical facilities that are bringing these low-income community members into court, well, these businesses, over 70% of them have lawyers sitting by their side. Over 70%. The common denominator here is representation. And that's what the Mississippi Center for Justice empowers me to work toward through the Delta Justice Court Navigator Program. Week after week, I see the same four-step scenario play out in justice courts in underserved communities throughout the Delta. A low-income community member is hauled into court, confused and afraid with no legal representation. 2, a landlord or a company sends a high-powered lawyer to sue that low-income community member. 3, the judge asks the community member if they in fact owe a bill or have failed to pay their rent. And 4, the community member, not realizing that they have other options, says yes. In the case of quick cash and payday loan businesses, or a credit card company, or a medical facility, the judge often orders the community member to pay the sum in a few days or have their wages garnished. They're not making a lot of money in the first place. In the case of landlord and tenant issues, the judge will oftentimes approve an eviction to take place in a few days. Here's a real life example. In January, it was really cold outside. And I know we all remember it because a winter storm was approaching. Earlier that morning, I had been passing out CDC eviction moratoriums at low-income apartment complexes in the city of Greenville, located in Washington County. What the CDC eviction moratorium said was if a tenant could not pay their rent because of a COVID-related circumstance, the landlord could not evict them while the moratorium was in place. So I would just stop by random low-income housing areas, apartment complexes, tape a CDC moratorium to a door, knock on the door, and walk away. Well, later that day, still in Greenville, I was attending Washington County Justice Court. It was the last case of the day. A short Black woman came forward and stood behind the defendant's podium. Her husband stood beside her. On the plaintiff's side stood a lawyer representing a landlord. The husband and wife had left their child with the neighbor that day so they could appear for their court hearing. Months earlier, both parents had been previously infected with the coronavirus and couldn't go to work. Therefore, they couldn't pay the rent for a few months. And here's where it really gets painful. At this point in the case, there are four parties. One, the judge, one, the judge, two, the defendants, which is the mother and the father, three, the plaintiff, which is the lawyer representing the landlord, and me sitting in observance. Everyone in the courtroom knew about the CDC eviction moratorium, except the defendant, mother, and father. Even though I'm a lawyer, I couldn't say anything in court because I haven't taken the Mississippi bar exam because of the pandemic. The judge couldn't really say anything because he has to be a neutral body. And it didn't benefit the plaintiff, the lawyer for the landlord to say anything because he's trying to collect rent. So the mother asked the judge if she could have 2 weeks to come up with the rent. The judge asked the landlord if he agrees. The lawyer reluctantly says yes. I walked out of the courtroom. While I stood on the sidewalk in the cold, the husband and wife exited the building as well. I reached into my bag, grabbed a copy of the CDC eviction moratorium, which I was handing out earlier at low-income apartments. I gave one to the couple and explained to them that all they needed to do was read it, sign it, and hand it to the landlord. And he couldn't evict them in the middle of a pandemic. I could see the weight lifted from their shoulders. And for me, that's what this work is all about. That's why I attended law school after retiring from the military. And that's why I came back to the Delta to work at the Mississippi Center for Justice. And because of support of donors and partners to the Mississippi Center for Justice, I have been provided with the necessary tools and resources to do this work to ensure low-income community members receive the help they need to navigate the justice court system. So I sincerely thank all donors for this because having grown up in poverty in the Mississippi Delta, I know that every little bit counts.
Wow. Thank you so much, Ty. And I know traveling the highways and byways of the Mississippi Delta and knowing from house to house, from town to town, county to county, that people are wanting different. They're wanting a different life. But sometimes the system is stacked or weaved against them. I am just proud to say that we are with an organization that works to change that system, to dismantle this systemic issues of racism. One of the issues that I mentioned earlier was, of course, Medicaid, and how in Mississippi, of course, Mississippi was one of the earlier states that was severely impacted by COVID-19, and it was like pulling, the veil from over her head or a bandage from a wound to see the disparity of death in the Black communities as a result of some of the underlying health issues, mainly because of lack of insurance. We know that in Mississippi, almost 200,000 people are without insurance. And these are what we call the working poor, people who work every day, but are not afforded enough money to have insurance, or the employer just doesn't provide it. And these are individuals and families. We implore you that if you have friends that are in our state legislature, if you know our governor, Tate Reeves, please support us in getting Initiative 76 through to expand Medicaid, to get health care for people so that they can have it won't have to use emergency room to get for as their primary means of care. So again, Mississippi Center for Justice is working with others in that area to get Medicaid expanded. Again, that's one of those areas that can sort of impact individuals that land them right there in justice court with bills, healthcare bills that they are then sued to pay on the meager wages that they earn in those areas. Thank you so much, Ty. And I want to thank, before I open the floor for questions I want to thank all of our participants tonight. Some of you are longtime MCJ supporters and partners, and we thank you so much for the support that you provide us in order to continue this work. We don't take it for granted, and we want you to know just how much we appreciate it. So if you have a question for any of our panelists this evening, please put them in the chat box, and I will pose those questions, and then we will hear from our host before we conclude our program. As I wait on anyone who may have a question for our panelists, and as I wait for our panelists to come back into the full Zoom, I want to invite all of you to attend our Mississippi on the Potomac event on June 17th. Mississippi on the Potomac, like all of our events, were formerly, pre-pandemic, of course, in person. We would host this event annually in Washington, D.C. The last few years, we hosted it at the Mayflower Hotel in the ballroom. It was a reception where we would honor people who are doing work, champion work in social justice, people, lawyers, congressmen, writers, artists. And this year, as we did last year, we will host this event virtually. And so I invite you all to join us for that event. We will be posting that information in the chat box. You can also go to our website at www.mscenterforjustice.org to find out more about the Potomac, Mississippi on the Potomac, as well as more about the work that we do in Mississippi. You see, I think I may have a question. I do have a question from Mary Ellen Johnson. What challenges are you undertaking under the Voting Rights Act against the state of Mississippi? Rob, you want to take that question?
Sure.
Thank you so much, Ms. Johnson.
Yeah. The challenge we're involved in right now is against Mississippi's felon disfranchisement provision from the 1890 Constitution, which disfranchises people because they were convicted of certain crimes that in 1890 were deemed to be Black crimes. Technically, that's not under the Voting Rights Act, that's under the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. But I anticipate we're going to be involved in a number of lawsuits, perhaps against the state over the state legislative redistricting, but I imagine against certain counties and cities that do not treat Black people fairly when they redraw the lines to elect the legislature and county governing boards and city councils. Because under the Voting Rights Act, they cannot, it is illegal to dilute Black voting strength, which is often done by minimizing the number of Black majority districts, maximizing the number of white majority districts. And we want to make sure that doesn't happen. And to the extent it does, in the next round of line drawing, which will be occurring in the next couple of years, we want to ensure that where Black voters are not treated fairly, we will be filing voting rights lawsuits in federal court.
Thanks, Rob. I would like for you too to just tell our participants just MCJ's role in getting the that 1890 provision that created the two-tier voting system moved from the Constitution. How we made it, how we worked in the court system, and then of course this ended up on the ballot this past fall.
Sure, we were part of a lawsuit against another racist provision of the 1890 Constitution, which is sort of this bizarre provision that provided that if no candidate for governor or other statewide, state-level office received both a majority of the popular vote and a majority of what is called in Mississippi the electoral vote, that is, a majority of more than 50% of the state's 122 House of Representatives districts. If the person did not meet both of those thresholds, the winner was selected by the Mississippi House of Representatives. And so it's sort of Mississippi's weird version of the Electoral College, but it had been adopted in 1890 as an additional hedge against the possibility that Black voters would elect a Black candidate to statewide office in Mississippi. And so we were part of a lawsuit against that. It was filed in 2019. Federal judge indicated that the provision seemed unconstitutional to him. And as a result, the legislature proposed an amendment to the Constitution that was passed by the voters that removed that racist provision from the Constitution.
Great. And it's amazing, if you're ever in Mississippi, particularly Jackson, Mississippi, I invite you to visit our civil rights, they call it the two museums, the Civil Rights Museum and the Museum of Mississippi History. But in the Civil Rights Museum, there is a display with that 1890 Constitution and quotes from those persons who were on that constitutional committee. And in that language, they specifically say that they're creating, whether it was the poll tax or the understanding clause, they were creating that as a way to disenfranchise Black voters, and specifically said that if that doesn't get them, the poll tax and understanding and the counting of the marbles in the jar, if that doesn't get them, then this two-tier system sure will. And so thanks to MCJ, Rob McDuff, and our partners, we were able to help move that to change by the voters. So, they took the flag down, but there are so many issues that we're tackling on a daily basis, not only in with regards to voting, but we know other issues that impact people on where they live on a daily basis. So I see one other question, and then we're going to move to close. I want to give our host an opportunity to say a few words. There's a question from Ivy and Marvin. Are there currently voting rights lawsuits either in progress or completed? And if they are in progress or completed, how effective are they? Rob?
Yeah, the case that was just mentioned about the 1890 provision regarding statewide elective office was filed and is now completed because it led to a repeal of that provision. Our challenge to the felon disfranchisement provision is still in progress. We have not succeeded on that yet. Hopefully we will. And we filed a lawsuit last year to expand absentee voting in light of the pandemic. And we won it in part, not completely, but in part. And we think that did lead to more people being able to vote absentee than otherwise would have. So that was a partial success. And then we are going to be filing some lawsuits in the future once the redistrictings come around. Great.
Thank you so much. One other question from Walter Boone. He's asking, do you expect that MCJ will be at the forefront of any efforts, it popped out before I had a chance, of any efforts to suppress minority voting? Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I think the main tool of suppression is going to be through the redistricting, and yes, we will be at the forefront of that. Now, we do not have any legislation in Mississippi like you have in Georgia and Florida that, for example, cut back on the hours of early voting, because unfortunately in Mississippi we don't have early voting, and there is no. The federal courts have rejected efforts to require states to adopt early voting. Now, once they do, if they cut back for racial reasons, as in Georgia, lawsuits can be filed and have been filed, and we'll see how those go. But the courts have said there is no constitutional right to early voting per se, and that each state has the right to set its own rules in that regard. So unfortunately, Mississippi is way behind other states in that regard, but it's something that has to be resolved through the legislative process, not through the courts on that particular angle. But in terms of the suppression that I think we will be seeing through redistricting, we will be very much involved.
And before I move to our host, I will say that in this past legislative session, there were a few bills that were on the floor for not only that you would consider voter suppression, but also to suppress public gatherings or protests that we believe were aimed particularly at Black Lives Matter types of protests. Those all failed, but I think what we're focusing on as we move forward, particularly as it relates to voting, is that we know we've got to be proactive, because we know that those that want to suppress the vote and deny voting to citizens, they're very active. They're active through organizations such as ALEC, American Legislative Exchange Council. So it's no happenstance that these bills are similar bills are being proposed and in some of these states passing, because these are bills that are drafted and basically just published throughout state legislatures, particularly those that can be pushed through by conservatives. So we want to be proactive as well. And part of that proactive, being able to monitor legislation, monitor actions by folks that would seek to oppress and minimize, marginalize, requires that we have resources to do the work when we're called to do it, but also being prepared to do the work and not being reactive. And so your support will go a long way to helping us being proactive as opposed to reactive, when we know that there are many forces out there that are very active and acting purposefully. So thank you for being here this evening. Certainly you can do, if you want to support MCJ, you can do so by going to our website, or I believe Elizabeth Bouillon, our Director of Philanthropy, has dropped our text to give number, which is 601-258-9640, or again, our website at mscenterforjustice.org /donate, or you can contact our Director of Philanthropy, Elizabeth Bouillon, at Bouillon, that's EBUYAN, at mscenterforjustice.org. And we would certainly appreciate all of the resources. So I want to invite our host back in, and I'd like for Mr. Olger Twyner to tell us about his role with MCJ and his support for MCJ, and then we will turn to Mary Miller and then to Joanne Edgar.
Thanks, Vangela. Good evening, everyone, and thanks for joining us. Why am I here tonight? I was born and raised in Mississippi, Jim Crow, Mississippi, to be precise. While it may seem incredible and like ancient history, I actually drank from a colored water fountain in Woolworths. I sat in the colored balcony of the Arabian Theater in Laurel, Mississippi, and I attended segregated public schools until ninth grade. Because of my experiences, in part, I decided to become a lawyer. I started my professional career in Mississippi, first clerking as in the U.S. District of Northern District of Mississippi, where I met then young civil rights lawyer Rob McDuff, and then at Southeast Mississippi Legal Services, where Martha Bergmark, MCJ founder, was executive director. In addition to daily delivery of legal services to the poor at Legal Services, I was able to engage in impact litigation on voting rights and education. However, over time, the ability of legal services programs to engage in such work was sharply curtailed. This is why the work of Mississippi Center for Justice is so important. While I no longer practice law and have enjoyed a career where I've tried to keep social justice and community outreach in focus, I have remained connected to the important work of the center and its mission. Tonight, you have learned about some of the center's current work, and there is so much more to be done. MCJ has stood in the gap. We can't backslide, and we appreciate your interest in and support of the center. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Olger. We so appreciate you, and we appreciate you inviting your friends and colleagues to join us here tonight. And we appreciate you continuing to stand in the gap with us. Thank you. Now I'd like to hear from Mary Miller, who I've found that we have quite a bit in common. And I have teased she and Joanne that they can look out their window any day now and see me standing out there waiting on them to come down, and we can go have a wonderful plate of Italian pasta. So a couple of weeks we'll be doing that, and maybe we'll post something for you to see. Mary, how are you this evening? I hope you've enjoyed this program. You're on mute.
Sorry,
Okay.
muted. Thank you very much, Vangela, and I'm looking forward to your visit to New York. Like Olger, I was born and raised in Mississippi, and although I've lived in the North for over 50 years, I still feel that I'm a Mississippian. And when anybody asks me, where are you from? I always say, I'm from Mississippi. I really love my home state, and there's a lot to love about Mississippi, and I want to see it prosper. But I realize that Mississippi and its people are not going to be able to realize their full potential until every Mississippian has equal access to fairness and justice. And that's really why I'm a great supporter of MCJ, because that's what MCJ is all about. MCJ's staff and volunteers are working very, very hard to create a better future for the state of Mississippi and its people. And they're doing so by advocating racial, social, and economic justice for all Mississippians, including those who are historically disadvantaged and those who are marginalized in Mississippi society. So I want to say to all of you who have joined us tonight, we're really grateful that you're here, and we really appreciate your interest in the good work of MCJ. And I want to ask you to lend your support to this very dedicated and courageous organization. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. We so appreciate you as well. You know, the connections and the compassion of Mississippians run deep, and so we are certainly very appreciative of your partnership in the work that we do and the change that we are working toward. Last but not least, our third host for this evening, Joanne Edgar. Joanne, I know she's raring to tell you about the Great Mississippi Road Trip. That's one of her favorite programs that we've sponsored over the years. Joanne?
Thanks, Angela. I'm a big fan of MCJ, and in fact, even though I'm not born in Mississippi, I feel like a Mississippian because my roots are there. And moving around a lot as a child, we always came home to Mississippi. So if anybody asks me where I'm from Mississippi. And because of all the things that we've heard tonight, MCJ makes me feel hopeful and even proud of Mississippi. The more I learn about what you're doing, the more hopeful I am, which brings me to the Great Mississippi Road Trip, an annual weekend bus trip, usually to the Mississippi Delta. And hold on, because, oh, here we go. Usually to the Mississippi Delta, and we go on a bus. The people on the bus include the MCJ staff and board members, and a civil rights historian who teaches at Jackson State. It also includes lawyers who lived the history of civil rights in Mississippi, and then people like me who want to learn more and support organizations like MCJ. The group that you're seeing right here is standing in front of Medgar Evers' home, which is the first stop on the bus tour. Medgar Evers, as you know, was assassinated in 1963. His home is part of Tougaloo College and is a museum, but it's not open to the public at the moment. But on the road trip, you get a personal private tour. We also visited frequently the offices of COFO, which was a major coalition of civil rights groups in the early 1960s that launched a statewide voter registration effort and the Mississippi Freedom Summer. And here I am with board member Barbara Lippman, who moved to Mississippi in the early 70s with her husband, David, who's a civil rights lawyer. And there's always a mic on the bus. And Barbara and David tell the story of what it was like to be newlyweds civil rights workers in the Mississippi Delta at the height of the civil rights movement. Also on our bus was Emmett Till's cousin, Wheeler Parker. Reverend Parker was with Emmett Till in the summer of 1957 when he was dragged from his bed, murdered, and dumped in the Tallahatchie River because he supposedly whistled at a white woman in the Bryant grocery store in Money, Mississippi. We visited Money, Mississippi. And in this photograph, we were part of the group that was commemorating a new marker at the place by the river where Emmett Till's body was found. This is the fourth marker that was on that spot. The first three were either thrown into the river or shot up by rifles. This particular marker that we commemorated that day is bulletproof. No civil rights tour would ever be complete without a visit to the Fannie Lou Hamer Memorial in Ruleville, Mississippi. This is Gordon Greenwood, who's a board member, and some of the people on the bus knew Mrs. Hamer, and boy, do we ever need her now. But we heard the stories of their time with Mrs. Hamer when she was alive. On the bus trip, we also meet MCJ's current clients, and they talk about their work on the local level. This is Tina Steele, and she's from the Sunflower County Consolidated School District and is an assistant principal at a high school. MCJ supported this district with training around cultural sensitivity and racial bias, as well as conflict resolution. We also visit in Indianola, where MCJ has an office, the B.B. King Museum. And here we are there in 2019. We eat great Southern food. And in 2019, we danced at B.B. King's nightclub, Club Ebony. Just because there are serious lawyers at MCJ doesn't mean they can't have fun. And here is Tina Steele again. She clearly has talents beyond education and she can really sing. But the bottom line for me is that MCJ reacts to emergencies without hesitation. As you heard, they also confront the injustice behind the crises in order to make bigger, more permanent change. Nothing's too big for you to tackle, Vangela. You know what's at stake. MCJ listens, organizes, litigates, negotiates, educates. I believe Mississippi is a better place because of MCJ. And I'll be on that bus again the next time it's ready to roll. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Joanne. And we'll be looking for you. We'll be looking for Olger and for Mary. We're going to save you seats on that bus and every one of our participants in this program this evening. We can't wait for you to come to Mississippi and experience the work that we do, where you can see where we put boots on the ground and where Ty drives those miles on Highway 61 and 49. You know, we'll even take you to where allegedly Robert Johnson made his deal with the devil to sing the blues, and maybe one of his many alleged burial sites. So come on down to Mississippi. But more than that, partner with MCJ to help change Mississippi. There's still a fight going on. The fight continues, and we're glad to be on the forefront of that fight. One of the things that I tell people, that reasons that I came to do this work is because I was sitting on the sideline in my private practice, law practice, saying, why don't they do something about this? Why don't they do something about that? And I realized that I'm a mother of 3 African-American men, 3 sons. I needed to be on the front lines doing something. I needed to be the they. And so I am now one of the they at MCJ that's fighting the fight. And we are proud to have you join us as partners. So I hope that each of you have enjoyed our presentation this evening. As you can see, we are fortunate to have a star lineup of some of the best, brightest legal minds around. And we would love for you to be a part of the advancement of racial, economic, and social justice in Mississippi. So I invite you once again to visit our website at www.mscenterforjustice.org to learn more about our work and how you can support the extraordinary work that we're doing every day in Mississippi to bring sustainable change, supporting the advancement of racial, economic, and social justice in Mississippi. So yes, certainly the challenges we face sometimes seem insurmountable, believe me, but they are conquerable with passion, hard work, and the right resources. You all know as well as I do that the law is a powerful tool for making change, and we would appreciate your partnership in addressing the inequities that are still plaguing our state today. Our efforts, past, present, and future, simply would not be possible without the support of wonderful donors like this evening's hosts, Olger Twyner, Mary Miller, and Joanne Edgar, and many of you. We hope that you'll join us for our upcoming annual event, Mississippi on the Potomac, which will be virtual on June 17th, for more programming, more information about our work, and a fabulous art experience with Wyatt Waters on the banks of the Tallahatchie River, where Emmett Till's body was pulled, in a magnificent, what we call gospaz group, singing throughout this year's event. So we are looking forward to you joining us and joining that experience. So again, we are so grateful to each one of you for joining us, giving us your time this evening. Good night.